Good morning. I think we're good. Carolyn, I have your message to go. All right, good morning. I am Jillian Heisey, and I am here with a good friend of mine, Teresa Bunner, this morning, and we are here to talk to you about basically the idea of how to bring conversations around race into the classroom. And when I talked to Teresa a few weeks ago about this idea and doing a session for the Ed Collab and wanting to develop further on the conversations we ourselves have been having, we kind of came up with this idea, and as we were talking, kind of throwing topics out there for the title, and I basically said, I think, it's really just about, like, I'm white, so now what? What do I do now? I'm white, how do I address this in the classroom and all that? So that's kind of where our title came from, and we both, as educators, have grappled with this and gone on a long journey and tried to figure things out. So that's what we're here to talk about today. I will pop our slide up just for a second so you can see our Twitter handles also if you don't have them already. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully worked great. So this is really just, you can contact either of us via Twitter, and where you can find our slides after the fact, because we'll be popping back and forth between the slides and between the session, so you can see all that information. And I'll just do a quick brief intro on me, and then I'll let Teresa introduce herself and we'll get going. So my background is I was a language arts teacher for 11 years, national board certified reading teachers and specialist certifications, have a master's in reading. And my most recent placement prior to my new job was at the Indian Community School of Milwaukee, which is for urban Native youth in the Milwaukee area. So I taught 7th and 8th grade language arts. About 2 years ago, I took a break from the classroom and did some consulting with teachers and professional development. And this year I've started back for another master's degree in library information science, because apparently, as my mother said, your first one wasn't good enough. What's wrong? But I really love the idea of getting to impact a whole school culture beyond just the classroom. And I'm really excited to be a librarian now. And I'm in an elementary school, which is a whole new world for me. But I'm in a really diverse district and working with kids where these conversations have to come up all the time. So I love that I get new perspective now on having these conversations with younger kids also. So I will let Teresa introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Jillian. And shout out to Jillian. I really appreciate being invited to be a part of what we're kind of seeing as living out a conversation that we have with each other all the time. I have been in public education for 27 years now. I have worked at the elementary, middle, and high school level. And in most of my career, I have worked in classrooms where most of my students do not look like me. When I entered the classroom 27 years ago, I probably would not have said out loud, I'm white, so now what? And so this has been a journey. And so I encourage any of you listening and joining us today to understand, as Jillian and I talk, that I really see it as a journey. There is not an end destination. I don't ever feel like I'm going to get to the point where I'm completely comfortable and know everything about how to have the kinds of conversations that we are talking about. But, we have to be willing to try. And when I looked at my classroom and I saw that a large number of the students who are failing my own class were students of color, particularly my boys, and came to a crossroads where I could either decide, well, it's them, and just kind of, I've done my job, I've taught or whatever. I said, or I realized really the common denominator in the end was me. And so maybe I needed to do some new learning. And so, that's kind of how I got to this point today. In addition to being a classroom teacher, currently I work as a high school literacy coordinating teacher for Wake County Public Schools. And so I work, yes, I'm one of those people. I'm at the Central Services office, but I do get out into schools and classrooms as much as I can. And for 5 years before that, I had the opportunity to work with the Blue Ribbon Mentor Advocate Program in Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools. That's an equity and advocacy program serving about 140 students of color in the Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools. And one of the highlights of my time there was the privilege of being able to co-facilitate professional development for teachers around the idea of culturally responsive and culturally sustaining classrooms. And my co-facilitators were, depending on the year, we did this for about 4 years, 15 to 20 high school students of color who talked directly to teachers about not only the research, but about their own experiences and what they needed from teachers. So they were my greatest teachers. And so much of what I'll share with you today, their voices echo in my head.
I love that. And I love so much of our conversations that Teresa and I have had, and we've been roommates at NCTE several times and have some really great early in the morning conversations and late at night conversations. But it's that type of conversation where I feel like I always walk away feeling smarter and better and more dedicated again to doing the work that we need to do with our kids. And I think for both of us, the thing that always comes back to is we work so hard ourselves as educators because it's about the kids and really being about those kids that are sitting in front of us. And, you know, I've worked in suburban schools with a lot of white kids. That's where I started my career. And I didn't know then what I know now about the conversations that I should have been having with them and what I should have been bringing into the classroom. And it wasn't until I got into those diverse districts and worked with kids who the culture was so crucially important to, and it was part of what we were doing in the classroom, that I began really my own growth and my own journey for what I needed to do even more in the classroom and be aware of more. You know, and I'll talk a little more about that later, but I think for both of us, I just keep going back to the fact that it's about the kids, and for it to be about the kids, we have to do this work ourselves as adults. And it's hard and it's difficult, and our whole time together today will be about some of those tough conversations and courageous conversations. And, you know, for both of us, it puts us in a vulnerable place to go out and do this live like this and share some of these conversations that we have kind of in our own space sometimes. But as we were planning for this and having that conversation, we just really felt like this is what people need to hear, is the way that we talk back and forth about things and share things. So a lot of what we'll do today is just having that conversation back and forth between us. And at the end, we'll share some resources also. But we just want to kind of help you think through where you're at in your journey, kind of where we're at in our journeys, and some of the things we've done along the way to help us get there. And then we'll also talk about some of those common questions that we get from educators also. So I'm going to turn it back over to Teresa now to kind of give us our call to action here today.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't find the mic button for a second there. This is the joy of being live and doing this way, y'all. So in a minute, Jillian, when she has a chance, so there's a slide. A lot of what I understand about privilege and the idea of white privilege comes from being open to listening to and learning from others. And Peggy McIntosh is one of the researchers who kind of initially put that idea out there, and I'll let you read her definition of privilege there. But the idea is that, and huge shout out to Dr. Debbie Reese in her opening talk. I just, you know, continually take information in and learn. And one of the things I've come to understand as a white educator, and it's important to call that out, that I am a white educator. And that's part of what I've learned, is that the privilege I have is that I don't have to call that out, because systemically through history in our country, we've kind of normalized that idea of being white as the norm. And so that's why we don't always call it out. And the idea of my privilege as a white person is that I don't have to think about it if I don't want to. And like many of you who listened to Dr. Reese this morning, I'm sure we have changed our grocery shopping habits. You know, I had always thought about it in the realm of, you know, mascots and books and things like that. So there was a big aha moment. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can go back in later and listen to her archived talk. But the idea is that we have privilege as white people and we don't have to call it out. And so, you know, it's vitally important that we do, and that we be willing to understand that. And I think Jillian has a great story to share with us about kind of how she had an aha. So even I think it's a fantastic illustration. I said, are you willing to kind of share it out? And I know that she did via social media, but I think it encapsulates this idea that keeps a lot of us as educators from having these conversations is, but I don't know everything yet. And we're not going to know everything. We can't know everything. And as Dr. Reese pointed out this morning, sometimes, you know, we don't know what we don't know, which is a phrase we use a lot in equity work, but it is being willing to know and to learn new things and to new insights. And I just want to throw out there too, we have, when you look back in the slides later, by not talking about it, we do talk about it. And that's something that we need to know and we need to understand. The absence of certain voices in my classroom, if I don't bring them in, jumps out. And I'll just quickly share a student story. And I always ask my students, is it okay if I share this if you're not there? And so when I did this work around facilitating with high school students of color, we were in kind of debriefing and preparing for our next session with teachers. And one of my students, you know, just kind of slammed her hands on the table at one point and said, "Mrs. Bunner, why are none of my teachers talking about Ferguson?" And I sat there for a minute, like I didn't know what to say. And I looked at her and I said, "I don't know. I don't know. So let's talk about that." And she said, "When they don't talk about it, that's my dad. That's my friends, that's my boyfriend." And by not talking about it, what they're telling me is they don't see me, they don't see that, they don't see the people that I care about in society and in their classroom. So, you know, I put that out there as a challenge to us, you know, because I know, and Jillian and I will talk a little bit later about, you know, the things we hear teachers say when we try to have these conversations. The absence of it does not mean it's not there. It just means we've sent that implicit message once again that you're invisible, that voice doesn't have credence, that conversation is not important. So, you know, bring that kind of challenge to yourself and mindset into this thinking.
Thanks, Teresa. I'm going to go back to that slide for just a second so that you can see that. I also added a quote from an article that I had read recently that was shared again and around this idea, because Teresa and I have had this conversation, but it really talks about the fact that the sociologists have done this work in looking at race-averse homes, where basically it's not talked about versus awareness and where it is discussed. And often I hear people and teachers talk about, you know, well, the kids are too young, they're not going to understand. But it's really this idea that when we avoid talking about it, it actually makes it more difficult later on for kids to wrestle with it and understand, versus having that conversation when they are young enough to start developing some ideas around it and having these discussions and understanding how complex this issue really is. So, Teresa mentioned that I was going to share a little story. So this fortuitously, I guess, happened right before we were talking about, I think it was the day before, or maybe the same day that we were going to have this conversation, Teresa and I, about what you know, we were going to discuss and do for this session. And what had happened was I actually wrote a piece for Choice Literacy. And the way that that works is sometimes you write the pieces a whole bunch at a time, and then, you know, Brenda publishes them when it seems to fit what she wants to talk about. And it's a great resource, Choice Literacy, and a lot of really good smart work happening there. But I had written about Classroom Book a Day. Classroom Book a Day I started it in 2014, and it was inspired by Donalyn Miller's Book a Day challenge. So if you don't know about that, you should look it up for sure. But what I decided to do was take the idea of Book a Day for teachers and bring it into my classroom and have a picture book shared every day of the school year, basically. And so with those 180 picture books, what great work we could do. If you want to know more about that, tweet me, let me know. I have lots of sessions I've done on it, and we have a Facebook group and that kind of stuff now. But the reason it's pertinent to this story is because this was 2 years ago that I wrote this piece, and it was just published recently. And what happened was, when it was published, I went back to look at it again, and what I noticed was the absence of diversity in the list of books that I had recommended when I wrote that article also. And I kind of went off on a Twitter, not a rampage, because that's a bad thing to say, but, you know, kind of a rampage at myself, I guess, but more of a Twitter rant about my own growth and what was wrong with 2 years ago what I even thought. So I did screenshot it to share it with you a little bit today so you can see the pieces there. It was on August 19th, and you can go back and find it on the slides later, obviously, and stuff to read through it. But basically what I talked about in here is the fact that in 2015, the work that I thought I was doing was good work, and I was already working with First Nations kids of multiple tribal nations, and thought that I was doing the right thing and bringing picture books in, which was good. But what I was missing was the fact that there was so much whiteness in this list that I had created of these books. And as you can see with my my kind of stream of consciousness thoughts that morning that I shared on Twitter was really just about the fact that I now 2 years later realize how far I have come in this journey, and that just in that short amount of time, how much I've impacted my own practice and what I talk about and what I share about and what I think about through making sure that there is always diverse representation in the books that I share, making sure that I'm seeking out those books and trying to do a better job of finding those creators who are people of color that are creating these stories and centering stories around marginalized cultures and communities that don't get shared a lot in different mediums that we have, and especially in picture books. And even as I went through this morning, and I was messaging Teresa even this morning that I was like putting together a list of books for today, I'm like, once again, like, where are all my books with Latino characters and Latina characters, and where are all my books by those creators? And every time I go to put a book list together in the past year and a half, I think even, I have really focused on that and know the importance of it. But it's still difficult to find it, and that makes it hard. But I do share that story because it was a really honest moment of me really just saying, wow, it was eye-opening to me, because I feel like I am trying so hard now. It was eye-opening that just 2 short years ago, that wasn't even crossing my mind at the time, and how different I look at things now. So it is a journey, and we'll make mistakes along the way, and we'll have screw ups, and we'll work toward understanding by listening to others and figuring it out, and trying to have a better understanding. I hope if you had a chance to listen to Dr. Debbie Reese this morning, that it opened your eyes to some things. I have followed her for a number of years, and now, especially with working with Native kids and seeing the work that she does and what she shares, and follow a lot of what she talks about, and know that this is important work, and it is about identity and culture and personal identity. And I think that when we don't bring these conversations into the classroom, and when we don't have these journeys to go on ourselves, this is why things like Charlottesville happen. This is why we have people in this country who think in this way, because they're never exposed to all these different cultures in a true, honest, contemporary way of looking at who these people are in our culture right now, and that they are all around us. And we have to have these conversations. I've often said, or I think it was a nerd camp, we were in a session, and I said, we no longer have the luxury of not having these conversations in the classroom. And that is a crucially important thing to remember, because whether we are white or not, these conversations have to happen in the classroom. And it can be more difficult when we're white, because we don't want to make a misstep. So it is definitely important to do, and you can't do it unless you go on your own journey. So wherever you're at in that journey, we want to embrace you and encourage you and support you through it. So I'll let Teresa pop back in now.
So, Jillian said a Twitter rant or a rampage, but really what I just love that Jillian was vulnerable enough and willing to share via Twitter on that day her reflective journey, because that's really what it is. We have to be reflective practitioners. We cannot get it all right every single day. And so as we go on our own journey, we have to be reflective, and we have to ask ourselves some questions. So on our journey, we need to think about what are our own biases, because we all have them. And I think a lot of times biases gets portrayed as always something negative. But, all of us, there's a sports team that we root for. There's a coffee drink that is our favorite. We have biases, and that's just a part of human nature. We favor certain things. The problem becomes when those biases do live out in a negative way, and we don't bring them to our conscious level. And there's a lot of debate out there right now around biases and how they are living out, especially in police violence and brutality against people of color. And I think when I look at an issue of that, really part of the problem is those people in those jobs aren't aware of their own biases and have not brought them to the forefront. But I don't think that is the only occupation or entity where that happens. And I think that we as teachers have to bring that forward. We have to understand where our own privilege is. Privilege looks a lot of different ways, depending on who you are. And if you don't understand that idea of privilege, then I encourage you to read some more, study some more, listen to other voices. And then we have to think about, once I know what my biases are and my privilege is, how does that impact how I view the world, how I approach things? Jillian talked about the idea that, recognizing that this list she had created was incredibly white. And I know I have done some studying around Dr. Banks, James Banks' work around multicultural education, and realizing that even in something where I'm writing an essential question for the unit that I'm about to go into, that we can ask those questions and the typical kind of Eurocentric way that curriculum has always been presented. And so it's not, it is, yes, definitely, we're talking about literacy, so it is definitely about the books and the texts that we choose, but it's also how we set those things up in our classrooms as far as the kinds of questions that we ask, the directions that we steer students. And Jillian, if it's okay, I just kind of want to quickly touch on, so Jillian and I were talking, we heard a conversation from a teacher about approaching kind of a social justice issue in their classroom, and a student expressed a concern via kind of a written note to the teacher about, I'm not sure we should talk about these things. And the teacher's comeback in the end was kind of like, but I know I'm right and I'm doing this. And my thought was, the teacher's not wrong, and that they were right to kind of approach that topic. But we also have to be very careful in our mindset that our biases also isn't that we're not willing to listen to our students. If I have a student in my classroom who proclaims a white supremacist viewpoint, for me to just say, oh, well, I'm right and you're wrong, is not going to do anything to help that young person sitting there change their mindset. And so I have to, as much as it may pain me and hurt me, I have to be willing to have a conversation with that student as well, so that I can understand where they are coming from, so that I might be able to broaden their perspective and help them see things in a different way. So in this work, we also need to be careful that our bias isn't that we're going in with the I'm right attitude, but that we really are open to hearing and to listening, even to those viewpoints that we don't agree with, because until we listen to those and understand them, we can't help change them.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. It was a conversation that we did have behind the scenes too, which I think is important, and it's also a check that we give ourselves. I sometimes will put things out there with like hashtag check your privilege when I feel like it's a book that can be really beneficial in that, and we do have to check our own privilege because we are white women and there is privilege inherent in that, in the lives that we've lived. And I do have to check that very often and remind myself of it very often. And I think one of the keys is, so often we feel like that piece of privilege can be seen in such a negative light, as far as like, I've done something wrong because I have white privilege. And it's not about the fact that I've done something wrong because I have it. It's about the fact that it exists, and acknowledging that it exists and knowing that it exists, and internally being able to catch myself when I see that privilege coming out, when I have a thought, because I'm still going to have those thoughts that I have, that because I have white privilege, if I see somebody walking toward me and have that instinctive thought of like, oh my gosh, I need to know that I have that thought and not beat myself up about it, but know that I have it and then switch it in the moment and understand why I need to switch it and why that thought is happening, and be able to have that awareness of it, because that's what's going to help you start thinking about things differently. It's what really has helped me think about things differently. And and knowing that I don't have to beat myself up because I have that privilege, but I have to do what I can to use it for good. And I have to do what I can to acknowledge it and share about it and talk about it and help other educators be able to, do things that they can do to help fight against that privilege and help our kids have an awareness of it. I want to share also a tweet stream that we had from one of our favorite people to follow on Twitter, Jess Lifshitz, who teaches 5th grade in the Chicago area. And this is just about something that ultimately at the end, she put this out there last week, and it's just about the fact that we have so much work to do. And so often we want to just rush into these things that are about social justice and these great things to do in the classroom, but I do love what she cautions there about making sure that we are not raising our voices over the voices of the people we say we're becoming allied with, and centering our own voices over others. And I also bring this up a little bit because in our conversations, Teresa and I, about getting started and prepping for this session, we had this great long conversation, and we're going to do this whole thing, and it's I'm white, so now what? And all of a sudden I stopped and I said to Teresa, I'm like, let's just take a moment. Like, can we do this? I'm a little bit nervous. Are we allowed to do this? Is it our right to come out and have this conversation and be the ones who are centering our white privilege view as part of this conversation? And ultimately, the conversation that we had, in going back and looking at a lot of conversations we've had with people of color and tweets and articles that we've read, is that they can't be the only ones doing it. We have to do this work, and we have to talk about this work. And we are not here, Teresa and I, today to raise our voices above anybody else, but we are here to try to be that voice that so many of the white teachers have of like, I don't know what to do next. And if we stay silent and just have our conversations between ourselves all the time and not go out and share more and help people process through it, then we aren't doing the advocacy work that we need to do to help support everything that's happening. So for us, it's about getting vulnerable, having that conversation, doing the work, and being open to sharing our own journey and where we've come. And it just really goes back again to that fact that we have to be doing this work, we have to have this talk, but also knowing that we have to raise up other voices and help share voices of people who are talking it all the time. And whether those are people of color educators and non-educators, or white educators who have gone far in this journey doing this work, we have to all share this so that we can grow and get better at it ourselves and learn from it. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa with our first kind of common question that we hear from teachers. We have a list of them that we started. And the first question that I'm going to have Teresa talk to is, but I don't serve a diverse classroom. Do I need to worry about this work?
Oh, I get to start with this one. Thanks, Jillian. So yes. That's the simple answer to that. The more convoluted answer, and once again, shout out to Dr. Reese this morning. She had a great point. She said the kids that you aren't trying to mirror in these diverse books, the white kids, those are the kids who can grow up to be the gatekeepers in public policy, in education. We could go into the statistics about the fact that 70 to 80%, depending on which statistical, venue you look at, 70 to 80% of the teaching population is white women. So we are gatekeepers in that education process. We could talk about the fact that when you get to superintendency levels and board level members, that there's not as many of us there. But so her point is that yes, because those students that we are sending out into that diverse world, and they will serve different roles, whether it's their own racial and ethnic, identity that we are, mirroring in those books. So yes, I can also come at it from the viewpoint as a mom. When I'm not an educator, I'm a mom to 4 boys. I am a mom to 4 white boys. I need my boys' teachers to help deliver the message that we're talking about at home. If we're having those conversations at home, I want them to be in educational settings and situations where they can have those conversations with their peers in a way in which they can listen to other voices as well. So if I'm not in a diverse classroom, I still have a responsibility because the world is diverse. And while 70 to 80% of the teaching population might be white female, we know we've entered that era where less than half or less of our student population statistically across the entire nation are white students. So the reality is that our demographics are changing, our world is changing, and that is a beautiful, wonderful thing and something to be celebrated. And so no matter what the students look like in our classrooms, we have to work in the text that we choose, in the lessons that we design, to ensure that we create environments where all voices are heard and all perspectives are heard, and that we seek to understand that which is not our own. So
yeah, definitely. I like how you've worded that at the end. And like I said, I always feel like I get smarter when I get to talk to Teresa. And this is part of why, because we have these conversations ourselves. So the next kind of question that we often hear from teachers is kind of the opposite of that, but I serve a really diverse classroom, and how can I find resources for everyone and every culture and all of that? So this kind of came about from a conversation that I had recently with a group of educators, and I was sharing it with Teresa after the fact, and I had kind of messaged her and another educator that does a lot of this work, and said, you know, this happened. I can't believe that this happened. I don't even know how to respond and where to go next. And I was sharing a book called Hey Black Child that's coming out in November, and it is a fabulous, fabulous book. And I'm going to forget the author right now, but I will have it on a slide later for you. But it's coming out in November, and I got to have an early peek at it, and I was sharing the book because I was graciously invited to a lunch with the publisher in Chicago during ALA with the author and the illustrator, and got to talk to them. And it's just this poem from that he wrote about 40 years ago for a play about Hey Black Child, and really just celebrating the Black children. And Brian Collier illustrates it, who did Trombone Shorty also, and Knock Knock, My Father's Dream to Me, and just celebrating these children. And the conversation that I had with some other educators was, but I don't want to call out the Black children in my class, because I also have Asian children and Latino children and all these other children, and Native children and white children. I don't want to just call out Black. And I personally was so taken aback by it, because I knew the moment I saw this book that this is the book we need to share in our classrooms. We need our Black children to be celebrated and to have that opportunity to say, hey, you can be anything you want to be in this world. And what a wonderful message we should send. And I just was shocked that somebody would say, well, I don't want to share it because I don't have this same book for every culture. And I think it's an important point to make that, yes, we aren't going to have the same resources for every culture and for every community that is marginalized, but we have to do what we can when we do have access to those books to bring them to the forefront. And this could be a whole nother session about the publishing industry and how we want to get more diverse books out there and all that, which, you know, has been talked about, and we can talk about more at length later. But to me, it's about that point of going into the classroom with that lens of privilege and saying, you know, part of my point back to these educators was, but your white children have been centered in books their entire lives. And the Black children in your classroom, even if there's only one child in there, still has been centered around white characters in their picture books for the majority of their lives. And so to call out this one book that I have that says, hey, Black child, let's celebrate you, whether you only have one Black child or whether you have a lot or whether you have none, I think is still crucially important, because we need to be able to celebrate all cultures and have them seen in the books that we share, and know that, you know, it's not like saying they're Black is a bad word to say. It is something that we can say, and we can talk about this, and we should talk about it, and we have to bring it into our classrooms and not let something like, I don't have enough resources, or, you know, I have too many, what do I do? Which usually we don't have too many resources for our students of color, but whether I have a lot of children of that culture or no children of that culture in my classroom, it is still a valuable conversation to bring into the classroom and to open up to the students that we are working with and that we are serving, to do it justice. It kind of leads right into, I kind of snuck right into our next question that we often hear also, which we put out there, which was, if I'm going to read a book about a Black character, do I also have to read a book about an Asian character or Indigenous or Latino, Latina? And of course the answer is, well, we would hope we could, but the reality is that that's not necessarily the resources we're going to have. And so we want to make sure that we aren't deciding not to share resources that can be great and stories that can be great that will celebrate a certain culture just because we don't have them for another one. So that's something that's really important. And I'm going to kick it over to Teresa in a moment here for the next question, because I know she's going to love that I'm putting this one right to her, which is, what if I make a mistake? What do we say to those teachers, Teresa?
Oh, what if I make a mistake? Good. Because that means you're human, and that means you took a risk. And once again, I don't think Dr. Reese could have set us up any better for this conversation. She talked about that idea this morning that if you fail, then you learn and you move forward. But just because you might make a mistake or you might fail is not an excuse for you to turn around and ignore it. And she said it so much better than I just did earlier. And I tweeted it out, so you go look at my tweet stream and it's in there. I'm just thinking, in working with my high school students that I worked with, when we would get to this point, because inevitably a teacher would say, but what if I make a misstep? What if I do something wrong? And I will never forget one of my students, Ruby, saying, I'd rather have you try and make a mistake than not try at all. Because at least if you try and you make a mistake, you've told me that you are trying to see me, that you are trying to see who I am and where I come from. And so we're all going to make a mistake. And what a brilliant, amazing, wonderful moment to when you either you realize that you've made the mistake, or someone points it out to you, to model for students how to have that conversation, how to admit to them, to yourself, hey, I made a mistake. I said this, or I did this. Help me understand how I could do that differently, or what I might need to see differently. And I think part of that and going on that journey is surrounding yourself with other people who bring different perspectives to you. I think about my Twitter stream now and who I follow and the voices that convict me on an almost daily basis to really think about what I'm doing. And then going to them. And I just think about I can't even, it was within the last year, the whole idea of wearing the safety pin as saying I'm a safe place and all of that. And on the Twitter feed, a lot of people took that up and were going with that. And then some educators and colleagues of color that I know stepped in and started saying, no, that's not what you all need to be doing. And I honestly had this visceral moment of, well, don't tell me not to wear a safety pin kind of a thing. And then I was like, oh, I've got to check my privilege. Really have to check my privilege. And so I started asking questions. Help me understand. Obviously I made a mistake jumping on this. So if you make a mistake, good. Learn from it, own it, reflect on it, value it, take the new learning you have as a result of that and move on.
And definitely, and also know who your safe people are to go talk to. And by that, I mean people that you feel completely comfortable being wide open, vulnerable with, and saying, I may have screwed up here. What do I do? And Teresa's one of my people for that, which is why we're having this conversation together and doing this. And knowing that there are people out there who will support you and can have that conversation. It doesn't have to be in a public sphere like Twitter. It can be if that's what works for you, but it can also be in private messages and discussions with people so that you have that safe place to talk and work through it, and then share your growth publicly so that more people can learn and grow with you. Like I shared my story earlier that I had put out there, I think it was really about learning and growing and sharing my journey. And in relation to what Teresa was just sharing, our fearless leader of the Ed Collab, Christopher Lehman, actually had a tweet stream that I bookmarked back on August 13th, because it was really important, and it's about this idea of making a mistake. And he basically calls it out and says, you're probably not doing it right if you don't get pushed back. And if you really are taking a risk, you will make mistakes, and you have to figure out how to do it. And it's a chance to learn when you get called out on something. And I think that that's so crucially important, because so often we want to jump to that point of defense or kind of that white fragility of like, but I didn't mean it that way. But our job, if we're called out, is to shut our mouths and listen and try and hear what is being said to us so that we can understand what is being said and why it's being said to us, and so that we can grow in that moment. And Chris ends his tweets with, if you're doing it right, then you listen and you grow and you do better the next time. And that's really what so much of this work is about. We're going to make missteps. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to put our foot in our mouth, and we're going to grow from it, and we're going to learn from it. And that's what's really crucially important. One last thing that we hear from teachers often is, I'm just not sure that I'm comfortable talking about this. And I want to quickly address this. I know we're running down on time. We want to share a few resources in the last minute or so we're together, but this idea of not being comfortable talking about it, I just want you to take a step back and think about those kids of color you may have had in your classroom, who are surrounded by white kids, who are surrounded by white teachers, and who are surrounded by white everywhere in the books that they read, in the texts that they're exposed to, and in all the conversations that are being had. And put yourself, well, you can't put yourself totally in those shoes, because you can't as a white person most times. But what you can do is take a second to try to be empathetic to it and understand how that feels. And so for you as the adult in the room and the person setting the example, to have a few moments of uncomfortability and being a little bit unsure is nothing compared to what those kids are going through all the time. And think about the difference that that can make for that child that is standing there and sitting there in your room, hearing you make that attempt of doing something to make an effort of going further, opening these conversations and having them in the classroom. So with that being said, we're going to jump into resources real quick here at the end. And I'm going to start it off, and then I'll let Teresa jump in for the last minutes. So we just have some resources to support your work. The first thing I want to focus on is some picture book recommendations, because I've done a lot with Classroom Book a Day and I talk about it a lot. Before I do that, I just want to highlight this tweet conversation that I had with Kathy Burnett a few weeks ago. And there was a question about, that Amy had put out about other books about racism and white supremacy and this kind of stuff. And Kathy said, I think we also need to highlight those books where people of color are loving and laughing and going to school, not always battling, just being, showing all sides of life. And I love that. There was another conversation that I had on Facebook last night that somebody had shared something about kids, with grandparents as their guardians, and said, bonus points if we have the grandparents, and I said, and bonus points if we have people of color too. And Donalyn commented back and was like, but I want our people of color not to always have to be struggling in stories. I want the positive representations. And I was like, yeah, you're right. Like, it slipped my mind once again. I know that we need that everyday diversity, and that's crucially important. That it can't always be a book about being Black. It can't be a book about being Latino. It can't be a book about being Native First Nations. It just can be a book about the fact that there's something going on in life, and they happen to be from that culture or that race. So, once again, it was that moment of like calling me out. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I need to remember that. So in my conversation with Kathy on Twitter, I said, that's right. We need to make sure that the only stories for people of color, kids of color, that they hear can't be historical and issue related. It has to be about more than that. So I'm going to quick throw up a slide. I know the tech is like, I'm getting better, but it's still a little slower than I want sometimes. So this is a slide, I call it my incomplete list because of my story earlier where I shared that, I thought my list was good, but then I realized it wasn't. But this is my incomplete list of a few picture book recommendations for any age. And I emphasize that because I think you can share them truly with any age. So there's some books to really start conversations, some books to see everyday diversity, and some books to really think about at the bottom, embracing acceptance and inclusivity as a whole. So all of these are books that I've read and would recommend and could be shared with kids, and books that you should know about and stories that you should be coming into our classrooms. Two at the bottom I want to highlight for you are Be Kind and Love. You're not going to find them out yet because they are not yet out. I, however, have been lucky enough to read early copies of both, and they are fabulous, fabulous books that you are going to want to share with the kids in your classrooms. Those two books are the two coming next year that I think are going to be the ones that need to be shared in every classroom to be having some of these conversations. So I am going to, with that note, turn it back over to Teresa for a minute to kind of wrap us up with our final thought here.
So the other two slides that we have on there, when you go in later and look at our slides, are some books for yourself to read, a few professional books. Courageous Conversations Around Race is one that has really shaped my thinking. I'm about halfway through because I'm just having to take breaks reading it so I can digest, for white folks who teach in the hood and the rest of y'all too. And then Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race. And I just had the privilege of hearing Dr. Tatum in person last week, like bucket list highlight of my life kind of a thing. And one of the things that I've learned for myself is I need information. I need to be immersed in those other viewpoints in order to learn and get to a certain comfort level. And I'm still not at that comfort level. This is 2 conversations I've had this week in front of audiences where I've had to stand up and say, I'm a white educator, and I have been incredibly nervous both times because, you know, that's not the conversation we always have. There's some websites on there, and the bookend to this Ed Collaborative Day is a couple of the amazing folks from Teaching Tolerance. So you don't have to know it on your own, but you have to know it. So immerse yourself in reading, in social media voices, whatever it takes for you to feel comfortable, because as my brilliant friend Jillian reminded us earlier, it's no longer a choice not to have these conversations. And so be brave, take risks, make mistakes, fail, and learn some more and start again tomorrow. Thanks so much for joining us, and I'll let Jillian sign us off.
And thank you for that. And do reach out if you want to further these conversations, because we know our time is up. I see Carolyn coming back being like, do you need to finish? We know our time is up, but we do just want to be open to those conversations on Twitter, wherever you can find us. Please reach out if you want to have further conversations, and go in good faith of doing this work for the right reasons and for the kids, and know that we are here to support you.
Well, thank you, Jillian. Thank you, Teresa, for that vote of confidence and those great resources that we will definitely need in examining our own biases and bringing inclusivity into the classrooms that we teach. For those of you who are still with us, do stay for our next sessions. We have lots of great upcoming sessions coming up. Just going to share with you what's coming up in our next session. We have Rachel Gabriel talking about finding key ingredients of effective literacy. That's workshop number 9. And then we have Chris talking about learning with the Educator Collaborative. That's if you're interested in more great PD and great low-cost online PD that you can get from the comfort of your homes, this is one of those presentations you want to look into, where Chris is talking more about days like this and other PD opportunities that you can avail of. So do stay with us. Thank you for joining in, and thanks again, ladies. Signing off then from this workshop.